Expedition 33 does a lot of things right to make the player feel engaged, a sense of progression, reward, and much more. Let's break down everything it does right, and hopefully you can take some of these lessons and implement them into your own project. Number 1. Low barrier to entry, high skill ceiling. A lot of turn-based action games make the mistake of either making the combat really simple for accessibility purposes or making it complicated to reward the specific player type that enjoys that. The problem with these approaches in isolation is that if the combat is simple, yes, it does make it accessible, but it also gets really repetitive really quickly. And if you make the combat complex out of the gate, then it will alienate a lot of your audience and it will be too difficult to understand. Especially as this is a Game Pass game that focuses on the audience type that enjoys lean back entertainment, they need to get the balance right. And they did. What is really important in terms of balancing the combat experience, first of all, is that the player can feel like they can strategize pretty quickly. Of course, with a game like this, you can expect a rock, paper, scissors style weakness and resistance system. And that is present for sure, but let's get on to the more interesting stuff. Expedition 33's combat system does this by using a very basic setup and execution system. For example, Luna's magic attacks give and take stains. Stains are essentially magical elements used to power other spells. For example, Ice Lance uses the Earth Stain to do extra damage, and when used gives an ice and light stain. This allows a new player to easily look down their list of moves and quickly find the best order to use spells to grant the most amount of damage. Another example is even simpler. Gustav gets an attack early called Marking Shot. What this allows him to do is mark an enemy, meaning the next attack that is landed on that enemy does additional damage. This in particular is an incredibly basic example of setup and execution, which is very easy to learn and understand for a new player, but allows them to feel like they are strategizing. Moving on to how the game becomes more complex as you learn the combat system. We really just look at what we just learned and think about how this can be utilized and combined between characters. For example, if Gustav hits an enemy with Marking Shot, and then the player can use one of Luna's default abilities, Immolation, which applies 3 burns but will apply 2 more burns if the enemy is marked. Additionally, if she has used Ice Lance previously, she will have an Ice Stain to do additional damage with this attack. Then if you use Melee's Swift Stride attack, which does low physical damage but switches her to Virtual Stance if the enemy is burning, then her next attack will do 200% more damage. Almost every attack in Expedition 33's combat system is designed to do a thing, and then do that thing better if another thing is in effect, and then give a thing to be used later on as well. It can become complicated, but the cadence is always the same. It's just how the player chooses to combine moves together and in what sequence that really gives the player a variety of different options and agency, and in turn makes them feel incredibly smart and rewarded. Number 2. Progression. Now there's a multitude of ways that Expedition 33 makes the player feel like they are getting better and stronger, but let's start with the more surface level example, the QTEs. The way Expedition 33's combat works is that whenever the enemy attacks, the player has the potential to negate all damage. They do this by either dodging, parrying, or jumping. To do any of these QTEs successfully, the player needs to learn the tells and the attack patterns of the enemies and time them almost perfectly. This mechanic organically gives the player a sense of progression. If it's an enemy which they have fought 10 times before, or a boss they have died on a few times, the more they fight against that enemy, the more damage they will be able to negate, which makes them feel stronger than when they first started. This mechanic is really interesting for a turn-based game, as many in this genre rely on stats and levels to make the player feel stronger and as a tool for them to overcome enemies. But in theory, the player could fight any enemy regardless of the level difference and still come out on top in Expedition 33. Now this game does have leveling and skill trees and the like, but before we move on to that, let's talk about the hidden hero of this combat system, the AP. In a lot of games of this genre, the player starts out with AP or MP or stamina or whatever, and it's usually full, let's say 10 out of 10. As they play through a combat scenario and use abilities, this AP diminishes and the player have to start using weaker and weaker abilities, and oftentimes, especially with mid to late game bosses, it just becomes a war of attrition. But with Expedition 33, it does 2 things differently. Firstly, it starts the player on near enough the same AP every fight, depending on the specific scenario, so you're not sharing resources from fight to fight. But more importantly, it starts the player either halfway to max max AP or lower. With this, coupled with the fact that each turn the player gains at least 1 AP, and the player always has access to a move, which is the basic attack, which grants them 1 AP, means that the goal isn't just to save AP, but it's to actually gain it instead. As fights go on, players, if they choose to gain more and more AP, they will be given access to bigger and more powerful moves, making them feel like they're getting stronger mid-fight. Whilst in other games, you'll be using your most strong abilities immediately and then slowly be using weaker and weaker ones to conserve MP. Now, I'm sure this has been done in other games of this genre before, but this is the first time I have personally come across it. The game also has a leveling system, of course. As players complete battles, they get XP, which levels them up. Leveling up grants the player access to increases in stats, which they choose, and it also gives them access to skill points, which grant them new abilities. This is the main source of progression across the game outside of combat. It's done relatively well, especially with how the skills tie into basic stat buffs and weapons, but there is one final progression mechanic which really takes the cake: the Pictos. The Pictos are passive benefits which the player adds into one of 3 slots. These Pictos are picked up from exploring either the open world segments or the more dungeon-like levels. One of the cool aspects about Pictos is that if you use them enough, you'll just get them as a passive, and you don't have to use that slot for them anymore. This is such a cool mechanic because firstly, it gives the player that sense of progression. They get stronger and stronger over time about the feeling of having a bunch of worse perks in their inventory which they don't use anymore, but also it just makes sense contextually. The more you use the Pictos in combat, the better you get with it. Eventually you just learn it and it becomes a part of you. Such a cool wrinkle in a system that is pretty basic, but it adds so much. Number 3. Combat always gives the player something to do. On your turn, you can do 4 things. You can shoot, do a basic attack, use a skill, or use an item. Shooting uses 1 AP, and of course skills can consume any number of AP. However, doing a basic attack and using an item consumes 0 AP. Now, the player might run out of items, but the player can always attack. Now, this isn't new or particularly special. A lot of games allow you to attack without using any MP or any resources. But what is special is what was said earlier in the video. Attacks give you AP. Not only can the player always attack and do damage, but the player can always gain AP, can always build up to being able to shoot or use a special ability again. This matches so well with the context of the game, the idea to keep fighting and to keep pushing forward. Rarely does combat feel like you've completely lost it, and one of the key reasons is that the player can always do something. However, even though shooting does require 1 AP, and so the player might not be able to use it all the time, it's important to talk about it. This is a very unique mechanic both on the surface but also in the context as well. Shooting gives the player 3 benefits that tie into pretty much everything which has been mentioned previously. Firstly, it's the main way players attack weak points. Most enemies have a weak point on them. Hitting it does a lot of damage and increases the stagger bar. Now, the second use is to break shields. Certain enemies, usually bosses, start out with a shield and can regain shields throughout the fight. Now, shooting is usually the best and most cost-effective way to break shields, as each shot counts as a separate hit, and you can also shoot as many times as the amount of AP you have. It's not just 1 shot per turn. And finally, the elemental fusion of your bullets. Each character has a different element that is tied to their bullets. For example, Luna has fire bullets, which can either hit enemies for a lot of damage if they are weak to fire, or it can set up for a combo with an ability which benefits from an enemy burning. Actually, one final thing, which is just more of an aesthetic thing than anything else. The fact that you can free aim when shooting your gun in a game like this is such a unique visual for this genre, and was something definitely worth adding. Now, there is plenty more to talk about regarding Expedition 33's combat, but for now I'll leave it here, as one of the core tenets of this channel was to deliver information and examples of good game design concisely with the viewer's time in mind. However, this game deserved the extra time and attention, I'm sure you can agree. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, tune to GDL next week for another entry into the game design library, and keep on keeping on.